A young woman walked out of her house and vanished without a trace. A few days later, police got involved, and right away, they uncovered several disturbing clues and a list of potential suspects. Despite that, they weren't able to solve this mystery. This went on until they stumbled upon one unusual piece of evidence, something that completely changed the course of the investigation and finally revealed what really happened to her. Misty Morse was born on April 10, 1978, in Springfield, Ohio. At some point, her family moved to a city called Indian Harbor Beach in Florida. Not long after the move, her parents decided to get a divorce, and Misty stayed with her mom but remained very close with her dad. She was a cheerful, outgoing girl who had lots of friends and loved outdoors. More than anything, she enjoyed swimming in the ocean, surfing, and just hanging out at the beach with her friends. After high school, Misty worked a few different jobs before enrolling in a local community college. She wasn't sure what career she wanted to pursue, so she planned to figure it out along the way. By the summer of 2000, 22-year-old Misty was working as a waitress at a local cafe and spending most of her free time with friends. On the evening of July 20th, Misty told her mom she was heading out. They talked for a few minutes, but then Misty's phone rang. She answered with just a few words, hung up, and told her mom she had to go. The next day, when her mother got home from work, Misty wasn't there. At first, she didn't think much of it. Misty sometimes worked late shifts, and on those days, they barely saw each other. Plus, she was an adult, so her mom thought that maybe she had just stayed over at a friend's place. But when another day passed and Misty still hadn't come home or reached out, her mom started to worry. It had been 2 days now, and there was not a single word from her. What made it even stranger was that they shared a car, switching off every week. But this time, Misty never came to pick it up. Her mom tried calling her multiple times, but Misty never answered. This went on until July 24th, when her worry turned into full-blown panic, and she decided it was time to go to the police. But before she could, there was a knock at the door. When she opened it, she saw police officers standing there, and the moment she looked at their faces, she knew something was terribly wrong. They told her they'd found Misty's body. On July 23rd, the day before police arrived at Misty's mother's door, a retired judge in Merritt Island stepped outside to mow his lawn. His property sat right along the river, and as soon as he looked toward the water, he noticed something weird. At first, he thought it was the body of a large animal in the river. Then, a strong, unmistakable smell of decay hit him. As he moved closer, he realized it wasn't an animal. It was a human body. The judge immediately notified the police. When officers arrived, they confirmed that it was a woman's body floating in the water. But they ran into a serious problem right away. The body was already in an advanced state of decomposition, making it extremely difficult to recover. To retrieve it without further damage, they had to use a special type of fabric, one that allowed water to drain through while keeping the remains securely contained. When detectives finally managed to retrieve the body, it became immediately clear they were dealing with a murder. The victim had no clothes on, and her wrists and ankles were bound with rope. Police also found large amounts of duct tape on her body. Her legs had been tied to plastic shopping bags, which investigators suspected had been filled with rocks or some other heavy objects meant to keep her submerged. But the bags apparently had torn open, and whatever was inside had spilled out. In addition to the rope and tape, detectives noticed something unusual. A few rubber cords, the kind specifically used to secure window protective screens, had also been tied around her body. All of these items were sent to the lab for analysis, while medical examiners began their work. But right away, they faced a major obstacle. Determining the exact cause of death was nearly impossible. There were no stab wounds or gunshot injuries, and the level of decomposition made it difficult to identify less obvious trauma. In the end, experts concluded that the most likely cause of death was either strangulation or drowning. The second theory suggested that she had been in the water for several days, and there was a strong possibility that she was still alive when she was thrown in. There were no obvious clues on the body, no DNA, fingerprints, or anything that could point to a suspect. So, investigators focused on identifying the victim. It wasn't easy, but the next day they finally got a match. Fingerprints confirmed that the woman found in the river was Misty Morse. By that time, forensic experts had already examined the ropes, plastic bags, and duct tape used to restrain her. But unfortunately, none of those items yielded any useful evidence. There was, however, one thing that stood out: a few short, dark hairs stuck to the duct tape. It was pretty obvious that they didn't belong to Misty, and detectives knew these hairs could be a crucial lead, so they sent them to the lab for further analysis. Once investigators confirmed Misty's identity, they went to speak with her mother. She told them the last time she saw her daughter was on the evening of July 20th, 3 days before Misty's body was found. She also mentioned something that caught their attention. Right before leaving the house, Misty got a short phone call. It seemed like someone had arrived to pick her up and was calling to let her know they were outside. But Misty never said who she was meeting, which made it much harder to track down a potential suspect. Hoping to find answers, detectives requested her phone records, but there was a major problem. At the time, phone companies didn't have the capability to provide details about incoming calls, not even the caller's number. The only thing police could confirm was that Misty received 2 calls that night. The first one lasted a few minutes. Then, shortly after, there was a second, much shorter call, the one her mother heard right before Misty walked out the door. When detectives searched Misty's room, they found her purse with all of her belongings, except for 2 things: her driver's license and her phone. The fact that she left her purse behind suggested that she likely hadn't planned to be gone for long, but somewhere along the way, something went terribly wrong. This led investigators to a troubling conclusion. Misty's killer was probably someone she knew well, someone she trusted enough to leave with that night. Forensic experts also had some interesting findings. While they hadn't recovered any clear evidence from the ropes or duct tape, they did notice something unusual. The type of rope used to bind Misty was commonly found on boats. Moreover, the nuts were tied in a way that suggested the killer had some kind of military or maritime training. These were knots typically taught in the Navy and the Coast Guard. And then there was the duct tape. It wasn't just any kind of tape. It was actually a special type, designed specifically for temporary repairs on boats. All of this pointed in a specific direction. Misty's killer not only had access to a boat, but likely had some kind of military background. With no other solid leads, detectives turned their focus to Misty's personal life, hoping to uncover any connections that might bring them closer to finding her killer. Misty's mother told detectives that in the weeks leading up to her death, she had been seeing a guy named Teddy. He was a relative of one of her coworkers, and while they had gone on a few dates, their relationship hadn't had time to develop into anything serious. But when police looked into Teddy's background, they found something alarming. He had a long criminal record. He was arrested for assaults, sexual offenses, theft, and some other crimes. Detectives brought him in for questioning, and Teddy confirmed that he and Misty had been casually seeing each other for a few weeks, but insisted he had no reason to hurt her. As the interrogation went on, detectives started to second-guess whether he was involved. Teddy genuinely seemed upset about Misty's death, and nothing in his behavior indicated that he was trying to hide something. Still, they weren't taking any chances and asked for a DNA sample. At that point, they didn't actually have any DNA from the killer, so this was more of a test to see if Teddy was willing to cooperate, and he agreed to provide his DNA sample right away. He also gave them permission to search his apartment without a warrant. Detectives looked everywhere, but found nothing that tied him to the crime. On top of that, investigators learned that Teddy had never served in the military and didn't have access to a boat. In the end, they started doubting his involvement and turned their attention to other potential suspects. Misty's relatives told investigators about another guy she had gone on a date with, someone named Bobby. At first, he didn't seem like a likely suspect, but then detectives learned something that caught their attention. After their date, Misty told friends that Bobby wasn't really her type and that she wasn't interested in seeing him again. But Bobby didn't seem to get the message. He kept calling, trying to convince her to meet up again. He was persistent, too persistent actually. In fact, Misty even told people that she felt like he was stalking her. Detectives decided to pay Bobby a visit, and as soon as they arrived at his house, they noticed something that made their suspicions grow. He had a boat on his property. Bobby agreed to answer their questions. He claimed that he wasn't too bothered that Misty stopped responding to him, but he did admit that he had been calling her every day, right up until July 23rd. That's when he found out she was dead. For the most part, Bobby acted like he was genuinely upset about Misty's death. But then, something completely unexpected happened. In the middle of the conversation, he suddenly reached into his pocket and pulled out Misty's driver's license, then handed it over to the detectives. He explained that he had been holding on to it since their first date. According to him, Misty didn't have any pockets that night, so she asked him to keep her ID for her, and then she simply forgot to take it back. Detectives found this story highly suspicious. Their date had been weeks ago. Was it really possible that Misty never noticed her ID was missing? And if she had left it with him, why wouldn't she have asked for it back? With growing doubts, investigators asked for permission to search Bobby's home. He agreed, but after a thorough search, they came up empty-handed. There was nothing linking him to the murder. And then there was another issue. Bobby had never served in the military, which didn't match the profile of the killer. So, it seemed like Bobby was just another dead end. In the end, detectives left Bobby's house empty-handed, but just as they were about to leave, he surprised them yet again. He suddenly remembered something from his date with Misty, something that might actually be useful. According to Bobby, Misty had mentioned an ex-boyfriend who had a reputation for being quite aggressive. Bobby didn't know his name, but he did recall one key detail. The guy had served in the Marines. That immediately caught the detectives' attention, so they went straight to Misty's mother to ask if she knew who Bobby might have been talking about. She immediately had an answer. His name was Brent Huck. Her mother explained that Misty and Brent had been together for quite a while, but had broken up about a year before her death. She remembered that Misty had described Brent as controlling and aggressive. He always wanted to know where she was, who she was with, and what she was doing. Eventually, his behavior became too much, and Misty ended the relationship. After that, her mother never heard anything about him again. Detectives started digging into Brent Huck, and what they found was quite interesting. He lived in the same area where Misty's body had been found. He had also served in the Marines, just like their profile suggested. And on top of that, he worked as a charter boat captain, meaning he had easy access to boats and the type of specialized equipment found on Misty's body. With all of this in mind, detectives decided to bring Brent in for questioning, but they didn't want to tip him off. Instead of confronting him directly, they told him they were just trying to gather as much information as possible about Misty's personal life, since they had no strong leads. Brent agreed to talk. He admitted that he and Misty continued seeing each other from time to time after their breakup, but insisted that their relationship was completely over. There was nothing romantic between them anymore. But as the conversation went on, something felt off. Brent didn't seem even remotely upset about Misty's death. If anything, he was the opposite. He came across as cocky, almost arrogant. It was a stark contrast to how other suspects reacted when talking about Misty's murder, and that alone was enough to make detectives suspicious. Despite Brent's arrogant demeanor, detectives managed to get some very interesting information out of him. When asked about the last time he spoke to Misty, Brent named the exact night she disappeared, Wednesday, July 20th. That was the same night Misty told her mom she was heading out to meet someone. Brent admitted that he called her twice that evening, but he insisted that they never saw each other that night. That immediately raised red flags for detectives. Based on what Misty's mother had told them, they were convinced that whoever made the last call was the person who picked her up, and Misty's phone records showed that she hadn't received any other calls that evening. But Brent stuck to his story. He claimed that he had called Misty because he had heard some rumors that she was telling people she was pregnant with his child. At the time, he was dating someone else, and according to him, these rumors were threatening his relationship. So he called Misty to convince her to stop spreading lies. Detectives, however, weren't buying it. For one, medical examiners found no signs of pregnancy during Misty's autopsy. And on top of that, none of her friends had ever heard her say anything about being pregnant. So Brent's entire story just didn't add up. Detectives asked Brent for permission to search his home, and, just like the previous suspects, he agreed. But this time, they found more than they expected. The first thing that caught their attention was in the kitchen. Brent had multiple plastic bags from the same store as the ones that had been tied to Misty's legs. At first, this didn't seem like much. After all, plenty of people shop at the same grocery store. But detectives decided to take a closer look. Forensic experts examined the manufacturing codes stamped onto each bag during production, and when they compared them with the ones found with Misty's body, they discovered something disturbing. They were all made at the same time, on the same production line, in the same factory. This meant that there was a strong chance that the bags used in the crime had come directly from Brent's kitchen. And that was just the beginning. In his garage, detectives found the exact same type of rubber cord that had been wrapped around Misty's body. Just like with the bags, they checked the serial number and confirmed that both the cord in Brent's garage and the one found on Misty's body had been produced on the same machine from the same batch. Then, they found a roll of special marine duct tape, the same kind that had been used to bind Misty. And finally, they discovered rope identical to what was found on Misty's body, tied with the exact same military-style knots. At this point, detectives didn't just have a suspicion, they had evidence. After wrapping up the search and analyzing all those items, detectives were almost certain that Brent was responsible for Misty's murder. They believed that he might have actually heard rumors about Misty being pregnant with his child and panicked. Maybe he feared this would ruin his current relationship and decided to eliminate the problem before it could escalate. What he didn't realize, however, was that Misty wasn't pregnant, and she likely had no idea that these rumors even existed. With all the evidence in hand, detectives took their case to the district attorney, hoping to move forward with formal charges. But then, things took a frustrating turn. After reviewing the case, the prosecutor refused to press charges. He explained that every single piece of evidence was circumstantial. There was no direct proof, no DNA, no eyewitnesses, no confession, just a strong chain of coincidences. And as convincing as it seemed, the prosecutor warned them that it wouldn't be enough for a conviction in court. In the end, he told detectives they needed to find something stronger. So, despite having a prime suspect and a mountain of circumstantial evidence, investigators found themselves back at square one, knowing who likely did it, but unable to prove his guilt. Detectives did have one more piece of evidence though, but unfortunately, it wasn't enough to crack the case. As we know, forensic experts had found a few short, dark hairs stuck to the duct tape on Misty's body. When they analyzed them, they discovered that the hairs belonged to an animal, most likely a dog. And Brent just so happened to own a black dog, a mix between a German Shepherd and a Rottweiler. Detectives strongly suspected that the hairs came from his dog, but there was a problem. In those years, no forensic lab in the country was capable of conducting a full DNA analysis on dog hair. Without that technology, they couldn't prove the hairs belonged to Brent's dog, and without the proof, the evidence was useless. So, with no other leads to follow, the case stalled. For months, detectives searched for anything that could break it open, but they kept hitting dead ends, and Misty's killer was still out there. For 2 years, the case remained at a standstill, until detectives took another look at the evidence and stumbled upon something new. They learned that a recent murder case in California had been solved using DNA analysis of dog hair, and this was exactly the kind of breakthrough they needed. Without wasting any time, they reached out to the same lab that had conducted the analysis in California and asked them to examine their evidence. Forensic experts extracted a DNA profile from the animal hairs found on the duct tape. Then, detectives collected a sample from Brent's dog. When the results came back, there was a perfect match. The hairs belonged to the same dog. And there was an even deeper connection. This wasn't just any dog. Misty had actually given Brent the dog as a gift back when they were dating. Now, detectives had the evidence they needed to finally bring him to justice. They went back to the prosecutor, and this time, he agreed to take the case to trial. On October 23, 2002, Brent was finally arrested, and a few months later, his trial began. Brent never backed down, insisting that he had nothing to do with Misty's murder. He claimed that the real killer must have been one of her other ex-boyfriends, but with a stack of evidence against him, the prosecution had no trouble convincing the jury of his guilt. In the end, Brent Huck was found guilty of kidnapping and murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. During the trial, prosecutors assumed that Brent had truly believed the pregnancy rumors and panicked, deciding to get rid of Misty before she could ruin his life. We may never know exactly how he convinced her to meet up that night, or how things escalated once she did, but detectives had their own theory. They believed Brent lured Misty to his home, tied her up, and loaded her into his boat. Then, he took her out on the water and threw her in, leaving her to drown. After his conviction, Brent tried to appeal, but the court denied his request. To this day, he remains behind bars, still insisting he's innocent. After the sentencing, Misty's father spoke to reporters. He said he hoped Brent would live 1,000 years in that prison cell, waking up every single day, remembering the pain he caused to their family. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.